In this deep dive session, we're going to take you inside Microsoft Identity, Authentication, and Authorization. What are they and how do they work? Are you ready? Greetings, my fellow YouTubers. So nice to see you again. Welcome to the channel. Andy here. This week, I thought I would take a look at Microsoft Identity, Authentication, and Authorization. Three critical components that don't just identify your users, but also authorize them and authenticate them into everyday work. Now, as a security component, it's absolutely critical that we understand exactly how each of these elements work. So in this video, I've got a really nice presentation and it's followed by a number of different demonstrations. We're going to take it from the perspective of a user account within a company. So I'm going to introduce you and talk a little bit about how Active Directory works and compare that to the likes of Azure Active Directory in the cloud. So if you're interested in certification and learning and moving your career forward, I guarantee that this is going to be a session that you're going to really enjoy. Now, if you enjoy the session, please bump the like button up there. It really does make a difference to my channel. And if you've not subscribed, well, hey, come on board, come and join our great learning community. And I love your comments and questions, so please just get those down below. I really do like those. All right, so without any further ado, I'm going to jump into the presentation and then we're going to take a look at some demos. Now stick around because I guarantee you're going to learn something. All right, you enjoy. So when we talk about identity, it really is all about you. So in this session, we're going to talk about identity, authentication, and authorization. Now, if you read any book about identity and security, these are the elements that are absolutely critical. So identity is about identifying yourself. And you can typically do this by your name, a username, an ID number, or some other method. Typically, authentication is how you prove your identity to someone. So again, you might use a simple password or a PIN number or something like that. But the problem with that method, of course, is it doesn't prove who you are. It simply proves that you know the password or you know the PIN number or something like that. Ultimately, then, once you've been authenticated, we then look at things like authorization. So what are you authorized to get access to? So it might be files and folders, it might be printers, it might be resources in the cloud, and so on. And ultimately, an identity platform will also have accountability. So I need to know what the user did, what resources the user accessed, and so on. So in its most basic form, identity is this. You walk into a building, of course, and before you can get access to the building, you typically go up to the reception desk and you say, I'm here for a meeting, and they will say, we need to prove your identity. So the first thing then is who are you? So who are you either in the organization and so on. So first of those then, we're going to talk about Active Directory. So in the days gone by, in fact, many companies still use this system. Active Directory is a database of users, contacts, and groups that is maintained on premises in what we call a domain controller. So Active Directory Domain Services is a service that you can install on Windows Server. And you can see here on the left-hand side, that's the representation of me installing the database. And on the right-hand side, this is Active Directory Users and Computers. And this is where you would create your users, groups, contacts, and so on. So Active Directory basically creates your objects into organizational units. So organizational units, of course, are like folders. It means that you can organize your users, groups, computers, devices, and so on. Now, because it's a database and it's identity, of course, then databases typically have attributes. A user's first name, last name, email address, and so on. And of course, once the user is in the database, you need to set up a password or other form of authentication. And once that user has been authenticated, they'll then get access to those resources. So let's take a look at creating an identity in Microsoft Windows Server Active Directory. So here I am in Windows Server Server Manager. I'm going to come up to Tools and I'm going to come into Active Directory, Users and Computers. And in here, you can see that I have quite a number of objects. First of all, I'm going to go into my organizational unit called IT. And here in IT, I'm going to right-click here and I'm going to create a new identity. And you can create an identity, of course, for a computer, for a contact, a group, or in this case, I'm going to create one for my user. And my user here, his name is James Kirk. I'm a bit of a Trekkie, as you may know. And I'm going to create a logon name for Captain Kirk. And I'm going to use his surname and an initial. And you can see it's at mycompany.com domain name here. So I put my password in now. And again, I'm just going to take that checkbox out just for the purpose of this demo. And I'm going to click on Next. And I've now completed this user account. So when I click onto the user account here, I can now see that I've created an identity for this user in Active Directory. And of course, I can control things like his logon hours, which workstations I'm going to allow him to log on to. I can fill in his details, because of course it's just a database, of course. So I'm happy with this, and I'm going to click OK. So now we have an identity. So Captain Kirk has his identity, he's got his username, and he's got his password. So now the next stage is to authenticate himself. So what happens next? So what happens when the user pops in their username and password? Well, on the left-hand side, starting off here, they contact the Active Directory domain controller, of course, and the domain controller is running something called the Key Distribution Center. Now, a component that's part of that is something called the Ticket Granting Service. So when the user presents their credentials, the first thing that the Ticket Granting Service will do is they will look through the user's sets of rights and permissions. So is this a genuine user? Are they using the correct password? And so on. Based on those credentials, the Ticket Granting Service will generate something called a Ticket Granting Ticket, a token, if you will. And that token is then cached on the user's machine. Of course, if the user requires any additional roles in the company, so for example, if the user joins a group or is granted a specific permission, the user would need to log off and log back on in order to refresh their ticket granting ticket or token. So what happens if the user requires access to a resource such as an Exchange server or a SharePoint resource? Well, in this case, the user simply passes their ticket granting ticket back to the Key Distribution Center or Ticket Granting Service. Again, the Ticket Granting Service will look through its list of rights and permissions, and it will say, hey, yes, absolutely, you have the right to access this resource. And the user is then granted what we call a service ticket. And you can see that stage 4 here, well, stage 3, the user passes that service ticket to the resource. Once it's been authorized, that an authorization token is then passed to the user's machine, and again, it's cached. And the user again gets their desktop, access to their resource, and everybody's happy. So how does that's basically what it is on premises. How does it compare, though, with Azure Active Directory and obviously life in the cloud? Well, Azure Active Directory differs from Active Directory in the fact that your data is stored in these vast data centers that host millions of users. And your data is replicated all around the world, which is absolutely awesome. But again, essentially, identity is the major control plane here. But instead of hosting Active Directory on your servers in your own workplace, we now store Active Directory as a service, or identity as a service. And in this case, we call it Azure Active Directory. So in this case, Microsoft are managing all aspects of the directory service. And if you want to manage your own users, then essentially you create a folder or tenant in this case. So if you use a Microsoft 365 account, Azure, whatever the service, you'll create a tenant. And in that tenant, you're responsible for creating your users, groups, of course, and any devices that you might have. So just like Azure Active Directory, I should say, any objects that you create will also have attributes. And of course, the benefit here, though, is once the user is authenticated, the user will then get access to lots of different resources. So let's have a quick look at how we create an identity in Microsoft 365. So here I am in Microsoft 365, and I'm going to come up here and I'm going to go into my users, and I'm going to go into active users. And here, of course, is my directory service. Hang on a minute, Andy. You just told me that you were going into Azure Active Directory. Well, in fact, if I scroll down and go into Azure Active Directory, you'll see that, in fact, they are one and the same. So Azure Active Directory, of course, is now part of Microsoft Entra. And indeed, if I go into my users here, you can see that, sure enough, my users are exactly the same as what I have in the cloud. So essentially, it doesn't really matter which service that you use, as long as you're accessing your corporate directory. So in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to add in a user. And in this user, I'm going to create a user called Jean-Luc. And Jean-Luc, of course, his second name is Jean-Luc Picard. And I'm going to put in a username of Picard J for Jean-Luc. Of course, I'm a Trekkie, of course. Now, in terms of a password, you can automate the password. But in this case, I'm going to create my own password for this user. And I'll just take that checkbox out at the moment. I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to click on Next. And of course, the next thing, the difference here in 365 is you've got to choose a location for the user account. So in this case, I'm just going to accept the United States here. I'm going to assign him a license. So first up, I'm going to assign him an E5 license and an EMNS license. And yeah, I'll give him a Windows 10 license, a Windows 10 11 license as well. And I'm going to click on Next. Now, the other thing I can also do is, do I want Jean-Luc to have any kind of admin access? In this case, no, he's just going to be a regular user. And I'm going to click on here. So there you have it. I have now created an identity for my friend Jean-Luc Picard. So here I put in my username and I'm going to click on Next, and I'm going to put in the user's password, and again it now goes through the authentication. So the authentication is the next part. That's proving who you are. Now in this case I'm using Jean-Luc's username and password. And you can see that I now have access to my Microsoft 365 portal and all of its resources. So on the subject of authentication, we need to prove who you are. And you can prove who you are in a number of ways. So I'm sure you maybe have been into buildings like this where you need a card key or some form of token to gain access. And the fact is that, well, you can ask what's wrong with this picture, and the fact is the answer is simple, that it relies simply on a username and password. So there has to be something more. So ultimately, time is moving on, and it's time to say goodbye to those passwords. So basically, something that you know is classed as a type 1 authentication method. So it's something that you know. Now, something that you know doesn't prove who you are. It just proves that you know the username and password. Whereas something that you have might be a card token, might be your phone, might be some kind of something physical that you actually have on you. So, for example, if you're using Windows Hello for Business or Windows Hello on a Windows laptop, or if you've got a Mac and you're using a fingerprint, or if you've got an iPhone that's using facial recognition, there you go. Again, something that you are is a fingerprint. So not only do I have the physical device, something that I have, but I'm proving who I am by a physical attribute. Facial recognition, an iris scan, the color portion of your eye. And also, you might even authenticate users by somewhere where they are. So, for example, Azure Active Directory's Conditional Access feature. So think about it. If you're a 4-star general and you're in the comms hut, then you have access, you're a 4-star general, you've got access to the system, and you're in a trusted location. So you can see that's the concept of multi-factor authentication. Passwords rely on something that you know, and sharing passwords is very much a commonplace. And of course, there are many tools out there that will steal users' passwords. John the Ripper, Loofcrack, Cain and Abel. They all are designed to intercept and steal users' passwords, and many of these tools are 25 years old, and they still work perfectly. So we really have to get away from passwords. And just to prove, by the way, that hackers are hacking into you, then check out this. If you go into My Sign-ins, so Microsoft.com/mysignins, you can go in and it will actually show you where you're logged into. So multi-factor authentication is definitely something that you need to do. So we all use MFA nowadays. So when you log into a resource, the Microsoft Azure or your authentication resource will say, hey, hang on, I need something else rather than just a password. So you can use the authentication. The Authenticator app, of course, has just been updated, and it will include a challenge, a number challenge. So you simply enter that challenge, and if you're approved, you'll then get access to the appropriate resource. Now, you can deploy as administrators multiple authentication methods in the likes of Azure Active Directory. Let's take a quick look at some of those. So on the subject of authentication methods then, what I'm going to do is I'm in here in Azure Active Directory, and I'm going to come down here into Protect and Secure. So in here we have a whole bunch of different mechanisms that we can use to protect and secure our resources. So first up then, what I'm going to do is I'm going to have a look at the Authentication Methods option here. So Authentication Methods, here you can choose which methods you want to bring in. So do you want to use a FIDO key? So these are hardware-based tokens. Do you want to use the Microsoft Authenticator app, SMS? We can also issue new employees with something called a temporary access pass. And you can even use third-party software as well. And recently, Microsoft have added in, you can voice calls. Of course, you've got one-time passcodes. I'm sure we've all seen those if you've done any work with your bank. And you can even have a digital certificate as an authentication mechanism. So, just looking at one of those, I can come into the Microsoft Authenticator. So I want to really encourage my users to use their authentication methods. So I can assign the authentication method to a particular group of users. So I can target all groups or all users or selected users. So in this case, I've selected my group and I've added in the Oslo group here. Okay, So my Oslo group is now been added. So now what I can do is I can now configure this. And I'm going to say, yes, allow users to use the one-time passcodes for the Microsoft Authenticator. I've enabled it. I'm saying all these users within the group, and I'm saying, yes, the application. So when the user receives a notification from the Authenticator, it will show the application that's requesting access, and also it will show where they're requesting access from. So if you suddenly find yourself with an authentication request for an app that's in Australia and you're in London, that's not right. So you would then quickly reject that. So this is really useful for deploying multi-factor authentication. So as well as the authentication methods, as I mentioned, multi-factor authentication, you can enforce or deploy multi-factor authentication through something called conditional access. And if you've not seen my conditional access videos, then definitely go and have a look at those. So one of the first things that you can do before you create a conditional access video is you can actually add in trusted either IP address ranges, trusted locations. So when a multi-factor authentication process identifies a user and attempts to authenticate that user, essentially what this does is it tests to see if the user is in a specific location. So again, this is another form of multi-factor authentication. So in here, a conditional access policy essentially is an additional layer of security. And essentially, it looks for signals. So is the user a particular member of a group, for example? Are they using a particular application or app? And in this case, I've said all apps. So in this case, they have to meet certain conditions. So for example, are they high risk? What device platform are they using? Are they in a particular location? And so on. And based on those conditions, you can then, of course, either choose to either allow or block access. And you can, if you allow access, you might say, okay, I need the device that they're logging in on to be a trusted device, or they require multi-factor authentication. And check it out, you can even control the session as well. So you can limit the time the user can remain in use on that system. So conditional access is awesome at adding an additional layer of authentication mechanisms. Okay, so authorization is the final component here. So you've been identified, you've been authorized, but what can you actually do? So in this section, we're going to talk about the different access models. So essentially, a subject or a user is essentially granted permissions to access or gain information on an object, for example, a file, a folder, a printer, or something like that. Typically, you have a series of access control rules, all right? Now, there are a number of different models out there, and I'm not going to bore you with them, but essentially mandatory access control. If you think about the 1960s and the 1970s and the military use of security, then typically if you had top secret clearance and a file was labeled top secret, you would typically have access to a file of that sort because it uses this labeling and classification. And in fact, Microsoft 365 uses this feature nowadays in Microsoft Purview. Another access method is discretionary access control. So this is user controlled. So for example, imagine yourself in File Explorer in Windows. Well, File Explorer, you can set your permissions on files. Who can access what? Are you going to give somebody read-only permission or full access control? And ultimately, administrators, you can grant them what we call RBAC, or role-based access control. So this is based on your job function. So in years gone by, you don't want to have a company that's full of top-level administrators. Things might go horribly wrong. So with RBAC, what you can do is you can assign permission based on job role. So for example, if I'm in the Exchange admin team, so Microsoft Exchange, of course, is email, then I have all the rights and privileges to manage that email. If I changed job roles, then I would have access to a different set of rules that would only grant me permissions for that particular application. So RBAC is excellent at protecting not just your data, but also from your users from having too many privileges and potentially making mistakes. Another type of access control is rule-based. So rule-based access control you might see, for example, on a firewall. So only allow specific types of traffic through a firewall. Okay. And again, what I've done here is I've put in a few slides. So as I said, mandatory access control, you might see this military use or labeling and classification. So you label content dependent on how sensitive that data is. So other access control methods include things like file and folder access. So you grant access to a particular file or a folder. And typically in the likes of Windows, you might have different levels of permissions. So full control, for example, might include all the individual access rights on the left-hand side, whereas read only, you might only have read and execute permissions. So you're not allowed to make changes to the file and so on. So again, access permissions and group roles. So for example, we have an access control list. So remember what I said, when the user logs in, that ticket granting ticket will contain a list of all the rights and privileges that that user has access to. Another type of permissioned control is ABAC, and we're starting to see this more and more now. So there's nothing worse than assigning you permissions and then you're joining a group and then you join another group and another group. And essentially what happens is as you move from group to group, the permissions are cumulative. So suddenly 5 years down the line, you go, oh my goodness, they've got all of those permissions. Whereas ABAC is based on attribute access control. So typically, let's say you're in a school. I set permissions on, let's say, year 5 students, that they have access to a particular resource. So in your user account properties, you're in the year 5 students department. If I change the department to, let's say, year 6, then you will no longer have access to the year 5, and it's dynamic. This is why it's such a powerful feature. All right, so ABAC is definitely the next big thing, and it's coming in big time. So let's have a look then at some of the authorization mechanisms that we have here in Microsoft 365. So what I'm going to do is, first of all, I'm going to open up OneDrive for Business. So here in OneDrive, of course, these are all my personal files that I might have here. So within the OneDrive for Business, again, I can just go into my files here, and you can see I've got a folder, I've got some documents here, and so on. So one of the things you might want to do is you might want to share out this document. So I can go to the Share tab here, and I can say, hey, you know, I want to share this out, let's say, with Joni in my organization. I can put in a little message, and I can say, okay, what permissions do I want this user to have? So I can share it with people in my organization. I can say they can edit it, or I just want them to be able to view. So that's the read and execute permission, as opposed to read, write, and change. So in this case, I just want Joni's view. So I don't want her to be able to download this file though, so I can actually block the download, and this will prevent her from downloading it, which means she can still access the document on site. So I'm going to click on apply, and again I could now send that link off to Joni. All right, and I've now shared that file. So that's an example of a authorization. So you set the permissions and she's then authorized to access that content. So what about RBAC then, the job roles? Well, first of all, I'm going to come back into active users here in my Azure Active Directory. And I'm going to scroll down here and remember Jean-Luc Picard. So we created a user called Jean-Luc. So what I want to do is I want to give Jean-Luc an admin role. So I can do this in a number of ways. I can either go in through role assignments here, or I can simply come into the user account, and at the moment Jean-Luc has no admin access. So I can go in and I can manage the role, and I can say, hey, you know, okay, I want Jean-Luc to be, let's say, well, a global admin is essentially a god user. So these guys can basically do everything. It's considered not good practice to have too many global admins. So in this case, I want Jean-Luc to be a help desk admin and a service support administrator, and he'll have all the rights and privileges associated with that role. So I can go ahead and I can say, yeah, hey, great, that's it. I have now assigned Jean-Luc those appropriate roles for his job. And you can see, there we go. Okay, now another type of attribute-based control or role-based control you can find if I go into, let's say, groups. So if I go into teams and groups and active teams and groups here, I can go in fact, I will do this through Azure Active Directory here actually. It's a little bit easier. I'm going to go into groups and I'm going to create a new group. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to create this as a security group. And I'll call this group the IT Bosses. Okay? And in here, I'm going to say I don't want to assign membership to a group. You can assign an owner if you want to, but instead of assigning manually, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to use ABAC, or attribute-based access control. So I'm going to come into dynamic user, and here is where I do a dynamic query. So I'm going to add in and say, right, okay, choose a property. So I'm going to say, hey, well, if the department equals, let's say, equals IT, okay, and my account or city will say equals, let's say Oslo, because I'm in Oslo this week. And there you go, there's the rule. So if the user equals department and they're in Oslo, then that is the rule, and the user would then become a member of that group. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back into Jean-Luc's account. So I'm just scrolling down. I'm going to go into Jean-Luc Picard. And instead of making Jean-Luc a member of a group here, what I simply want to do is I want to change the attributes for Jean-Luc. So I simply go to his contact information. I now make him a member of the IT team. And of course, I can specify that he's now in Oslo. So now Jean-Luc is a member of that group. That is an example of ABAC. So if Jean-Luc changed department or changed role, he would dynamically be removed or added and so on. Isn't that cool? So there you have it, 3 critical components in the modern organization: identity, authentication, and authorization. I really hope that you enjoyed the session, and if you did, bump the like button. It really does make a difference. And if you've not subscribed, well, hey, come on board. Click that subscribe button, ring that bell, and come and join the great learning community that I'm trying to build out. And if you've got questions about this or in fact any of my other sessions, of course, just get them down below and I will do my very best for you. That's it for this time. So from a chilly Oslo, I will see you soon. Take care. Hey, thanks so much for dropping by today. Here's a couple of videos that you may enjoy, and while you're here, go ahead, click on the subscribe button and you won't miss out.